On November 4th, 1961, another secret meeting was held regarding Cuba. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, still aimed to overthrow Castro. He proposed that conditions on the island continue to be escalated through sabotage, espionage, and public unrest carried out by Cubans themselves. The operation was codenamed Mongoose. The United States campaign against Cuba and NATO members undermining the United Nations led to serious consequences. The Soviet Union decided to equip Cuba with nuclear weapons. This dangerous decision by Moscow led to direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. In his autobiography, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev justified this dangerous arming as follows.
Given the constant threat caused by American interference in the politics of that Caribbean island, the question arose, what should our policy be? This question haunted me constantly. Everyone agreed that America would not leave Cuba alone if we did nothing to prevent it. One thought kept running through my mind. What would happen if we lost Cuba? If Cuba fell, other Latin American countries would turn their backs on us, arguing that despite our power, the Soviet Union could not help Cuba.
On May 21, 1962, in Moscow, during a meeting of the political leadership, it was decided that the best response would be to deploy medium-range tactical missiles to Cuba. This plan was named Operation Anadyr. It was to be implemented by early November and kept strictly secret. While the United States did everything in its power to overthrow Castro, the Soviets armed Cuba in what became a true race. The Soviets initiated Operation Anadyr and sent tanks, fighters, combat vehicles, trucks, helicopters, anti-aircraft missiles, bombers, and over 50,000 soldiers transported by ships across the Atlantic to Cuba. The heart of Operation Anadyr was the deployment of a total of 60 missiles with nuclear warheads, including 36 medium-range R-12 missiles and 24 long-range R-14 missiles. The warheads and missiles were delivered by various ships. Only the medium-range missiles reached Cuba, as the Soviet ships carrying the long-range missiles were intercepted and turned back to the Soviet Union. The first ship set sail on June 12, 1962, and arrived in Cuba 2 weeks later. A total of 85 passenger and cargo ships made approximately 150 trips between the Soviet Union and Cuba from July to October. Everything was kept in strict secrecy on their first voyage. Ship captains and battalion commanders received sealed envelopes they were only allowed to open upon reaching predetermined coordinates in the Atlantic Ocean. The letters instructed them to proceed to Cuba. During installation on Cuba, the missiles had to be protected from sabotage. Therefore, the larger weapon systems were only transported to Cuba from September onwards. 2 cargo ships transported the 36 medium-range missiles, which arrived in mid-September, and their warheads arrived on October 4th. When President Kennedy gave his televised speech on October 22nd, it was already known that half of the R-12 missiles had been set up to be fueled, a process that takes about 18 hours. None of the missiles were yet planned for flight, and the warheads were still in bunkers. Thus, the nuclear missiles were not yet ready for use. The Cubans welcomed this additional armament, as the arrival of nuclear missiles alongside tanks and trucks remained strictly guarded secrets. On October 14th, an American reconnaissance plane flew into Cuban airspace at high altitude and photographed the missile sites. Compared to today's technology, image transmission was slow. The photos were developed and analyzed on Monday, and the president was only shown them on Tuesday. The photographs confirmed that Cuba was in the midst of arming with nuclear missiles. President Kennedy immediately called his closest advisors to the White House and established the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Kennedy was keenly aware of the danger of nuclear war erupting. The atmosphere was tense. Meetings at the White House were conducted in strict secrecy to avoid drawing attention from journalists with the sudden arrival of black limousines. Sometimes, as many as 9 people were squeezed into one limousine. Neither Castro nor Khrushchev knew that the United States had discovered the missiles. Up until October 22nd, NATO and the American Congress had not been informed. Once the missiles in Cuba were ready for combat, an airstrike would be very risky. Moreover, a naval blockade would be pointless if the weapons were already in Cuba. Kennedy and his advisors immediately decided they had to compel the Soviets to remove the missiles. The question of how to achieve this goal was the main topic of the Executive Committee's sessions. The United States did not want to justify before the Security Council how the Soviet Union had no right to deploy missiles in Cuba when the first and only nuclear base was located there. While the United States had placed its nuclear missiles in Italy, Great Britain, and Turkey in close proximity to the Soviet Union, recorded conversations showed that even the American president did not know where all of America's nuclear missiles were located. At one meeting, Kennedy asked, "Why did Khrushchev place them there? That would be like us putting medium-range missiles in Turkey. I suppose that would be damn dangerous." His national security advisor, Bundy, replied, "But that's exactly what we've done, Mr. President." When it comes to military strategies, the most aggressive option was a heavy airstrike followed by an invasion. This was precisely what the Pentagon generals desired. A slightly less intense approach would be a surgical airstrike on selected targets. The mildest option was a naval blockade, which required neither an island invasion nor bombing. After 6 hours of deliberation, Kennedy opted for a naval blockade. President Kennedy addressed the nation on October 22nd via radio and television. In his speech, he described the situation in the Caribbean and highlighted the danger of Soviet missiles being moved to Cuba. Kennedy concluded by stating that any missile launch from Cuban territory towards any Western Hemisphere country would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States. This speech, along with the subsequent diplomatic and military actions taken by the American government, marked the culmination of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The two major military powers were on the brink of a nuclear catastrophe. Kennedy signed Directive 3504 on October 23rd, implementing a naval blockade to prevent the importation of all offensive weapons to Cuba. NATO members, including Great Britain and France, unanimously supported the United States and demanded the withdrawal of Soviet missiles. The British ambassador argued that nuclear weapons were necessary, with no controversy surrounding their deployment. Thus, the pattern of debate became clear. NATO considered their own missiles defensive, while labeling Soviet missiles as offensive. Countries led by Moscow within the Warsaw Pact viewed the situation differently and demanded the lifting of the naval blockade. Romanian Ambassador Mircea Melita claimed that a long series of American aggressive acts aimed at overthrowing the legitimate Cuban government. On October 24th, Soviet leadership intercepted a message from the U.S. Strategic Air Command, instructing preparations for a nuclear attack. The American invasion of Cuba was scheduled for October 26th. On that day, all Cuban air defense units were placed on high alert. American bombers equipped with nuclear bombs remained in constant readiness to attack targets in the Soviet Union. In the southern United States, American forces awaited orders to invade Cuba. Soviet ships and submarines sailed between Cuba and the Soviet Union, while Soviet soldiers on Cuba worked on missile launch sites to prepare nuclear missiles for use. Soviet ground troops were equipped with tactical nuclear missiles, ready to fire at American troops in case of invasion. Castro anticipated an invasion, and his army stood guard at their positions, feeling that hell was very near. On October 27th, U.S. Attorney General and the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, met with Soviet ambassador to the U.S. Anatoly Dobrynin. On behalf of the president, he stated that if Soviet strategic missiles were not removed from Cuba, the U.S. would be forced to initiate hostile actions by next week. He added that the president wished to avoid war at all costs, but the risk of military catastrophe was increasing by the hour. Therefore, both sides needed to reach an agreement literally within the next few hours. Regarding the deployment of missile bases in Turkey as the only obstacle to a solution, the President of the United States saw no difficulty in addressing this issue. After all, the deployment of missile bases in Turkey had been formalized by NATO's official decision. However, the President was willing to negotiate on this issue behind the scenes. Moscow was also concerned about the situation's development. Khrushchev and the Central Committee were ready, fearing that fatal messages from Cuba could arrive at any moment. Daily meetings were held to assess the situation and consider different options. After receiving a message from Kennedy, Khrushchev decided to immediately respond positively, especially since the American president had guaranteed Cuba's security in exchange for the withdrawal of missiles from Turkey. With every minute feeling like an eternity, it was decided that the Soviet government's response would be announced on Moscow radio, a unique occurrence in world diplomacy. According to President Khrushchev, any delay would be equivalent to death. Finally, on October 28th, Pravda published Khrushchev's appeal to President Kennedy, which concluded with a commitment to withdraw those assets from Cuba considered aggressive, along with agreeing to implement this under a UN resolution. U.S. representatives would issue a statement on withdrawing their missiles from Turkey. The President of the United States did not delay in responding. "I welcome your message and consider it an important contribution to peace." On October 28th, Cuba also received a telegram. Moscow explained that it had to withdraw missiles to prevent the eruption of a global conflagration and the destruction of everything achieved by the Cuban Revolution. Castro was furious about the agreement reached between Americans and Russians, especially because he was not involved in any way. On October 30th, the Soviet government received the U.S. president's decision to eliminate missiles in Turkey without mentioning its connection to the Cuban events. Thus, the formal Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end. Numerous books have been written about the Cuban crisis, particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It became the first topic of Russian-American cooperation in studying the Cold War. Therefore, everything about it and its course is well documented. What happened during this crisis had a significant impact on events in the Soviet Union. It was later one of the reasons for Khrushchev's removal from all positions. It remains unclear how surprising it was for both sides and whether there was something behind the scenes that we do not know. One mystery related to this is the Penkovsky affair, named after Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, who was arrested on October 22nd for leaking highly classified Soviet secrets the same day Kennedy announced the blockade of Cuba. In the West, Penkovsky was considered their most important spy ever. Oleg Penkovsky informed the Americans that the Soviet Union in the Caribbean crisis would not rely on intercontinental ballistic missiles, but on R-12 ballistic missiles, later discovered by American reconnaissance planes in Cuba. Khrushchev was removed 2 years later on October 14, 1964. Just 5 days later, on October 19th, Chief of the General Staff Marshal Beryozov, arriving for the celebration of the liberation of Belgrade, died in a plane crash that collided with a building. 32 people died, including the entire Soviet delegation and other prominent conspirators against Khrushchev. At the time, the head of Yugoslav security, General Ivan Miskovic, said the Soviets only asked about this tragedy once and showed no further interest.